Hello everyone, I am Michael Sloyer, and today I am here with Rasanath. He is an ex-investment banker turned monk turned founder of Upbuild and now serves as a coach and Enneagram workshop leader at Upbuild. And today we're talking about one of the aspects of the Enneagram that I find most fascinating, and that is the levels of consciousness. So Rasanath, why don't you start by telling us how you define consciousness and why the levels of consciousness are so important?
Thank you, Michael. Consciousness can have many different definitions, but the simplest way to define consciousness is awareness. And when we talk about levels of consciousness as it pertains to an individual, it essentially translates into how aware we are of a particular situation and how that situation is affecting us and how it's affecting other people around us. So with respect to the Enneagram, the way we use the concept of levels of consciousness is to understand how aware we are of how the external world is affecting our feelings, our emotions, our thoughts, then consequently our reactions.
And so when we think about the levels of consciousness on the Enneagram, how many levels are there and what do you call them?
The levels of consciousness are a spectrum. So imagine, a grayscale, and on one end it's white, on the other end it's black. The levels of consciousness are a grayscale. It's a continuum. So you can divide it into as many smaller units as you would want to. But for the sake of understanding and evaluating where we are functioning, we at Upbuild divided into three broad levels of consciousness that we call creative, controlling, and destructive.
So creative is at the top.
That's right.
And
so
what do you mean by creative?
So when I said that the levels of consciousness is a grayscale, you can imagine the creative to be the white, bright side of the spectrum, and the destructive to be the dark side of the spectrum. When we say that someone is functioning at the creative levels of consciousness, it doesn't mean that the person is a good artist or a writer. That is usually the way we use the word creative. But in this situation, or in this case, the word creative actually points to the fact that when we are functioning at this level of consciousness, we are extremely aware of all the choices that are available in front of us in any given situation, particularly a difficult testing situation. We are aware of all the possible choices that are available to us, and we have the capacity to make the choice that is beneficial for us and everybody around us.
I see.
Right. So there are two things to the creative levels of consciousness: the ability to see the choices, and then the ability to act on the choice that is beneficial for myself and for everybody around me.
Got it. And so if somebody was functioning in the creative level of consciousness, what might that look like?
For example, if someone says something to me that was embarrassing, or I felt the sting of shame, I can actually recognize that this is what I'm experiencing when this person says this or said this. I can catch that, and I can actually respond in a way. When you said that, so for example, when a person says that to me, I can actually say, when you said that, it made me feel a little ashamed. And I want to know why I was feeling more ashamed, as a more exploratory reaction to it, or if it's a situation where it feels very confrontational, perhaps even going into conflict, you can potentially say, hey, when you said that, it really made me feel ashamed. And I just wanted to let you know that that's not a very good place for us to start this conversation from. So perhaps we can change the tone or change your word choice so that I can really enter into this conversation with a deeper sense of honesty. So that is the way we can choose to communicate. One, when we are aware of what's happening, and number two, when we know that there is a way to respond to this that doesn't blame the other person, that doesn't react and do something very similar in a sense, okay, since I'm feeling shame and you're making me feel ashamed of myself, and I'm going to make you feel ashamed of yourself, right? That's typically like it's a tit for tat, an eye for an eye kind of reaction. But we know that's not beneficial for either one of us, nor for a particular situation, especially if it's a conflict-ridden situation.
I'm seeing already how little I function in the creative level of consciousness.
It's the fact that you can say that itself actually brings you up instantaneously to the creative levels of consciousness. That's the paradoxical nature of the creative levels, is when we say, wow, actually there is more work to be done, and we can perpetually live there in that space where we feel like, wow, there is so much more that I'm not able to see, or asking ourselves this question, what am I not seeing in this situation? That is, as soon as you ask that question or question yourself in that way, that immediately brings you to the creative levels of consciousness.
Very good. So I think that brings us to the next level of consciousness. So one step below the creative level, what would that be?
So we call it controlling levels of consciousness. And the reason why this is called controlling levels is because at this level of consciousness, the situation, the circumstance around us is not necessarily giving us what we want. And with relationship to the Enneagram, we say that we are not getting the validation that we all seek. Now, it is happening even in the creative levels. But in the creative levels, when I don't get the validation that I want, I recognize what's happening. I also recognize that it's something that I need to own, that it's my issue. And then I respond from a place where I take responsibility for what I feel. At the controlling levels of consciousness, as soon as I feel I'm not getting the validation, I try to get it by controlling my external
So that's why we call it the controlling.
That's why we call it the controlling levels of consciousness. The immediate reaction is, how do I manipulate my environment, which includes people, to get the validation that I want? Now, when we enter into the controlling levels of consciousness, if you remember in the creative levels, we said two things. We said the capacity to see all the choices available in front of us, and then the capacity to act on the choice that is going to be the most beneficial for us and for our environment. In the controlling levels of consciousness, especially when we are dipping in, many times we know what the right thing to do is. Many times we also see most of the choices that we have in front of us, but somehow we do not have the capacity to act on it. Somehow we actually give into perhaps a lower way of reacting. And now when we come from from a place of wanting validation and trying to get it by not a very straightforward, perhaps even an introspective and kind and empathic fashion, then that's where the spiral into the controlling levels of consciousness begin. Now what triggers this, us going into the controlling levels of consciousness, is the fear that the fact that I didn't get the validation means that I may not be the person that I think I am. And that fear is the trigger that spirals us down.
And so I can imagine that not only does it not feel great to be the one who's in the controlling level of consciousness, but what is it like for others on the receiving end of people who are in the controlling level of consciousness?
It's interesting you say that, because many times in the controlling levels of consciousness, you will see, at least when we begin to function in the controlling levels of consciousness, things look fairly great. You also begin to feel that you are in control of the situation, especially when your controlling strategy actually gives you the validation that you want.
So it's working.
It's working. You feel that it's working, and that again fuels the downward spiral, because you think that this is exactly the way you need to act to get what you want. Right. So at the controlling levels of consciousness, the instant reaction can easily be something that feels good, but in the long term, it comes back to hurt, because when you control somebody else, the other person may give you what you want, but kind of give you resentfully, give you that resentfully, and so you get what you want, but now you have withdrawn from that other relationship. And when that continues to happen time and again, the strategy actually backfires at a certain point where now it starts to create trouble for both people.
And so as we continue to spiral down the levels of consciousness, that's when we get to the third level.
Yes, we wind up in the destructive levels of consciousness.
And what is that like? That doesn't sound very good.
Definitely not. And again, this is important to keep in mind that the reason why we spiral down to the destructive levels of consciousness is because we have been hurt repeatedly by not getting the validation that we want. And we don't recognize that the way we are pursuing it is actually exactly going, in the opposite direction, which means that the way I'm pursuing my desire for validation is driving people away. And I don't recognize that. And we know what the definition of insanity is. It's doing the same behavior again and again, expecting a different result. So even before we wind down in the destructive levels of consciousness, we unconsciously are, quote unquote, behaving in an insane fashion where we try to control again and control again, but now it's not giving me what I want.
We actually have less and less control as we're going for more and more control.
And people are leaving me, people are becoming hostile, people don't like me anymore, and then it fuels my story further that it's the world outside and it's not me. And so I need to get my validation at any cost because the world outside is so unfair and unjust. Right? And as soon as that becomes a very strong story, then we wind down in the destructive levels of consciousness. And at the destructive levels of consciousness, it's I need my fixation at all costs. It doesn't matter how it affects other people.
So that's really the critical difference between the controlling level and the destructive level.
That's right.
At the controlling level, we still kind of think that we're doing what's best for the other person, even though we're really not. But at the destructive level, we don't even care.
Right. At the higher levels of controlling, at the higher levels of the controlling spectrum, we see that there is still goodness. You don't want to hurt the other person. But at the same time, your need for validation is just so strong that you inherently end up at least a little bit pinching the other person. It's like when you are really hungry, you don't want to steal from somebody else's plate, but your hunger sometimes forces you to do that. You don't want to make the other person starve. But because you're so hungry, you actually take things away from somebody else. At the destructive levels of consciousness, it's very different. It's almost like this person is the cause of my hunger, and so I'm going to make the person feel.
There's a lot of blame.
There is blame. There is also a certain sense of vendetta, and at that levels of consciousness, you also your validation is coming at the cost of somebody else's well-being, and it actually doesn't matter. It almost feels like, well, that person deserves it.
All right, so we've gone pretty dark here. What is the silver lining here? How can we actually rise up the levels of consciousness?
The biggest thing that we have to recognize is, and the opening to rising up the levels of consciousness is the effect that our behavior has on other people and ourselves. It is really hard to see that we are causing pain to somebody else. And when the heart opens to having that connection of empathy, even if it's a small sliver, if it's a small window that opens up, that immediately brings us to, I can't do that. Or look what I'm doing to our relationship. Right? Those moments are the moments that we have to really grab onto. But we find many times that even when those moments appear, and as we are going back up the levels of consciousness, we are so much surrounded by guilt and shame in terms of what we have done and how we have gone about seeking our validation, that we feel the need to justify. So many times we don't really go all the way through. We don't really go all the way to say, it doesn't matter what you did or didn't. The fact that I chose to act in a way that actually hurt you, that's my responsibility.
It's about owning it.
It's about completely owning it, irrespective of what the other person did, right? And that to me, the carrying that kind of responsibility is what really helps us rise back up to the levels of consciousness, go back into the creative levels of consciousness. And if we can do that repeatedly, consistently, and bring that kind of approach to every single relationship, then we will see that our base level of functioning starts to go up. And by that what I mean is sometimes when days are good, we can find ourselves functioning more at the creative levels of consciousness. But one thing goes wrong and we return to our baseline, which can be
I know it well.
which can be the controlling levels. I know it very well too. And I was sharing with a dear friend of mine yesterday about how I feel that when people say, oh, you are, it's so nice to be in your presence, I many times wonder, well, what are the things in my life that can go wrong and the darker side of me can actually show up in an instant. And it's waiting to come out. And many times circumstantially it stays in. But the idea here is to recognize that as much as we have the potential for the bright side, we also have the potential for the dark side. And being very aware of it. And drawing our guardrails very intentionally to not hurt somebody. And even if we do, then how do we immediately go back and take full responsibility for what we did?
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Such a pleasure talking to you.